everyone. It's our Tell All Tuesday, and last week we had a weather delay, if you can imagine. And both Amy and I live in New England, and we had a terrible storm that wiped out our internet. So we're offering our Tell All Tuesday this week, and the title of it is Embryo donation as an option for family creation. And I am so honored that Amelia Demma is Skyping in or calling in from ASRM in Baltimore. So thank you, Amy, for being here and taking time out of that amazing conference to share your wisdom with us. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Kristen. Yes, of course, always my pleasure to chat with you. Particularly inspirational to chat with you today, as I am at the American Society for Reproductive Medicine conference, where much of our colleagues from the mental health profession, from physicians to nurses to attorneys, are gathering to speak about embryo donation as a family building option. So it's a very current topic, certainly one of interest for prospective parents, but also one that professionals do quite often come together to discuss. So your topic is timely, appropriate, and exciting. Thank you.
I'm beside myself. Let me just tell everybody a little bit about you. So Amelia Demma is a New York licensed attorney and founder of the law office of Amelia Demma, providing services to those who engage in assisted family building, specifically egg, embryo, and sperm donation, as well as compassionate surrogacy. Amy is actively engaged in the nation's most established infertility patient advocate groups and other non-profit and professional organizations. And as we just talked before we went live, you've been attending all the workshops and conferences over the last 3 weeks, and so you are always on the cutting edge of the legal facet to create your family. So I am so grateful that we have this time together. And I wanted to start with a question that you and I were just discussing, is that of personhood. And if you are a couple and you've received the diagnosis of infertility, and as you and I know, the diagnosis of infertility means that you have, after 12 months of exposure to sperm, if you're a woman, have not been able to create or sustain a pregnancy. And so my first question about embryo donation, caught that one, as a family option, do you need to have the diagnosis of infertility to look at this as an option?
Not necessarily. And in fact, Kristen, one of the most cutting edge discussions that I have participated in over the course of the last 3 weeks at the various conferences that I have been attending. Yesterday, I attended the inaugural meeting of a new special interest group here at the American Society for Reproductive Medicine. And that special interest group is being put together to address the unique needs of the gay family building population as well as the single parent building population. Not necessarily are those folks managing a medical diagnosis. They very well may be, but the fact that they are either same-sex couples or a single intended or prospective parent also puts them in the camp of what we refer to as social infertility, non-medical needs to be accessing assisted reproductive care. Embryo donation is available to all who seek the treatment of reproductive endocrinologists, as long as that patient fits within the policies and practices at that particular clinic. There is not necessarily a requirement of a medical diagnosis. Embryo donation has been around for quite a while. It is gaining more and more attention as more folks become aware of it. So I really am tremendously grateful to you for this opportunity. As I was scrolling through my file on you, Kristen Darcy, I noticed that we spoke in 2013. You and I worked together on an embryo donation presentation. So we're both committed, you and I, to educating about this family building option. Its general appeal is to those who are otherwise unable to afford embryo creation through IVF. So if you are somebody who is otherwise priced out of pursuing parenthood because you cannot afford to engage in either a direct IVF cycle or an egg donation cycle, or you are pursuing family building and surrogacy is a part of your plan, if you're a gay couple, for example, or a single gentleman, for example, adding on the expense of embryo creation just might have family building option cost prohibitive to you. So when we already have created the embryos, we are taking the cost of the IVF out of the equation, and therefore it opens up assisted family building to so many other hopeful prospective parents. And that's really what drives my work in this area. I know that the clients that I have helped and I have counseled in their family building with donated embryos would not have been able to engage in that process for financial reasons. And so, and I will address your slight slip of the tongue there when you were talking, you almost said embryo adoption.
And I know you, and I'm trained not to say that, and I still slip, baby.
Here's what's relevant about that within the context of a discussion of costs. So the folks who pursue this agenda of embryo adoption are typically extremely conservative folks. They tend to be faith-based, and they tend to view embryos as persons. They tend to assign the status of embryos to that which you and I and born babies and young people know to have as people. So we refer to that movement as the personhood movement. There is nothing in the law. There are a couple of states, Louisiana comes to mind as an extremely conservative state with respect to assisted family building, which has defined embryos as something more than property. In the law, generally speaking, embryos are property. And the transfer of embryos from the person who created them or owns the embryos to somebody needing them for a family building is handled as a matter of contract law. So the transfer of ownership of embryos is handled in contract law. The embryo adoption folks, we were talking before about the great appeal of this family building option being that of the relatively low cost. In the last several years, I have watched what the embryo adoption folks have been doing. They are misleading the public. And by the way, if you go through an embryo adoption agency, which is something I say in quotes, if they go through the embryo adoption agency model, the fees are $15,000 to $20,000. And that's pretty much in line with what folks are paying for egg donation. Okay. And so the low barrier to entry in terms of costs, now, if you are pursuing embryo adoption, again, there is no legal reason for doing so. It is really a philosophical, often faith-based discussion. If you are pursuing that model, you are paying multiple times what you otherwise would if you were engaged in embryo donation.
So in a way, Amy, are you saying that the cost benefit of embryo donation is that the fee to create the embryos is not included because these embryos are already created?
Yeah,
but the fees increase if it's quote unquote an adoption because there's that's the basically it's taking one away and making it from the other direction, the fees.
Well, what happens is the embryo adoption model includes things that are standard in an adoption proceeding.
Right.
It includes things like a home study. And those sorts of things which are not a part of the embryo donation model.
Right.
And that's why those folks who understand that embryo donation is the legally appropriate way to pursue this form of family building. There is not a court in the United States that would issue an adoption decree on an 8-cell embryo. Adoption decrees, the adoption proceeding, is only available to born persons. You must be born in order for you, my apologies, you must be born in order for you to, my apologies.
Amy, you're such a busy woman. Thank you for your time.
You must be born in order for you to be placed in an adoptive family structure. So there is no legal remedy. There are no legal proceedings available to those who are transferring embryos from the party who created them to the party who will now be using them. Okay, it is an inappropriate label for this process. And folks need to be educated that really what they are engaging in is this pursuit of a political, social, religious agenda that contradicts what we are doing in progressive family building.
Well, thank you, because you have taught me well not to use that term. And even though I have the awareness of it, it still slips out just like I almost did before. So I appreciate you sharing that, because you know why this has come into, you know, such an important discussion for the people that I see because of, you know, Amy, we've had this discussion before. When people come and seek out help or support through a fertility coach, it's really that they are emotionally drained and hopeless. Yep. And what you and I share is that there is such a broad base of options, much different than 20 years ago when you and I were trying, you know, to create our families. Yeah. And how this really needs to be in the forefront, especially for, and as you know, you donate your time to us during the Making Dad Summit, that how this is such an important topic to talk about for men who have had cancer, who are in a position, not only female infertility, male infertility, that this is such an important option for you know, the male of the partnership, regardless if it's a single male or a partnered male, to know that this is an option to create a family.
Yeah. Yep. There are lots of folks who access embryo donation as a family building option. Folks who are certainly hetero couples who can't afford egg donation. So the profile of the patient of the donor embryo recipient is pretty broad. And so this message really applies to a pretty expansive audience.
So Amy, so you talked a little bit about how the donation of embryos relieves the cost of creating embryos, but you can walk through the legal stance. So someone is exploring this as an option, or has come to the place that this is what this is how they feel that they want to create their family, and for whatever personal reason that they have. It's their choice.
It's now, usually financially motivated, Kristen. It usually is financially motivated. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Okay. See, what I feel, what I hear about it is, especially for men, and I, you know, I'm the emotional and you're the legal. They say, you know, this option is so powerful for their couple because the female gets to experience the pregnancy. And neither one has a biological component to the donated embryos. So let's talk through. So what is the first thing someone should do when they want this as an option?
Find embryos. The biggest challenge in family building with embryo donation is identifying embryos. There are more recipients looking for embryos than there are accessing them. And so often clients will call me. It's fairly rare, although not absolutely, it's fairly rare that folks call and it is frequent that folks call and say, can you help me find embryos? It is relatively rare that folks call me and say, I have embryos to donate. Can you help? I do get those calls occasionally, probably once every couple of years. At least every 6 to 8 weeks, I hear from somebody who wants some assistance in finding embryos. I give them some pointers. I tell them that there are various online resources. There's a Facebook page, although that Facebook page tends to use the adoption language. They really are just desperate intended parents hoping that they can find embryos somewhere. There are various websites, for-profit services who do have embryos available. I always tell folks to go to their clinic first.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
If their clinic has a inventory of embryos available for donation. Typically, I don't step into an active role in this process until embryos have been identified, until donors have been identified. Once the donor of the embryos has been identified, we then bring in one or more other attorneys to represent the donor, and I will represent the recipient. Sometimes it's more than 2 attorneys, sometimes it's 3 attorneys, because depending on the relationship between the parties who made those embryos, I may make the legal call that we're going to view this as an egg donation and a sperm donation, and that the sperm provider and the egg provider need independent legal counsel. So I just completed an embryo donation where in fact there were 3 attorneys present. I represented the recipient, a colleague represented the egg donor or the egg provider, and a colleague represented the sperm provider. Those 2 providers had come together to create embryos. They were not a married couple, and I made the call, was my legal judgment, that it was appropriate for them to have independent legal counsel. So again, the biggest challenge is identifying the embryos. Once we find available embryos, and those embryos have to be approved by the clinic as appropriate for frozen embryo transfer. So even when clients call me and say, I met someone online and she's got embryos she's willing to give to me, let's move forward with legal, I slow them down. And we go back to the clinic where the embryo transfer is anticipated. It's typically the clinic where the intended parents have been cycling, and usually unsuccessfully cycling. And we go back to that clinic and say, hey, we found these embryos. They were created at a clinic across the country. Embryologist, will you take a look at the embryology reports?
Okay, I was going to ask that question. Across state, how does that work? So
there are no issues whatsoever with crossing states with embryos. So, and I just referenced across the state as a matter of conversation. It could be down the block. The point being, if you found embryos created at a clinic other than where you are currently cycling, then your embryologist at your clinic will need to review the embryology records and decide whether or not those embryos meet your clinic's standard for frozen embryo transfers.
Okay.
So not all embryos are accepted for embryo donation. So the first hurdle we need to overcome is, are these embryos of appropriate quality for frozen embryo transfer as per the clinic that will do the frozen embryo transfer? And often clinics will decline. They'll take a look at the embryos. Now remember, these were embryos that were not chosen for the initial embryo transfer, right? Embryos are all graded. When you're doing a fresh cycle, the best embryos are selected for transfer. The remainder get frozen. So this is what we're looking at. We're looking at embryos that did not make that first round of selection. Now, maybe they're all grade A embryos, and with most folks doing no more than 2 embryo transfers, and most folks really pursuing single embryo transfer, we could get lucky and find a batch of all grade A embryos.
Right. I had a client that had 20 wonderful eggs, and I was like, oh, good, God bless you. And so in my mind, that's what I'm thinking the eggs are. So that you brought up a good point, that they're not the first pick of a litter,
20 wonderful eggs don't necessarily make 20 wonderful embryos.
No, I know.
Got a sperm factor there as well, and that may bring down the grading of the embryos. So that's your first hurdle. So you've found these embryos. We're still not ready to pursue with legal because we don't know if actually a transfer is going to occur. So we get the embryology records, we bring them to the clinic where the intended parent has been cycling or would like to cycle. Gay men don't tend to have a long history with IVF centers, and often will go to where the embryos were created. But for discussion purposes, we're bringing these embryos somewhere other than where they were created. And that embryologist at that clinic has to decide that those embryos are appropriate for the process. There are a whole bunch of other clearances that need to occur. I've actually put together a roadmap for prospective parents or intended parents. You can find that roadmap. I have a blog site, eggdonationtoday.com. You can go to eggdonationtoday.com and search for embryo donation. And there's a roadmap there that takes intended parents through the process of getting the embryos cleared for their family building effort. And those clearances are psych clearance. Are these parties, these intended recipients, intended parents deemed appropriate by the mental health professional affiliated with the clinic as appropriate for recipients of donated embryos? Medical clearance. Is the woman to whom the embryos will be transferred, is she appropriate for a pregnancy? FDA clearance, were the mandated, required by law screenings, infectious disease screenings done on those embryos when the embryos were created? So there are a series of clearances that we go through to be sure that the embryos, so you work really hard to find embryos and then you're still not there. You still have to pass all of these standards.
Right.
Once we get the green light from the clinic, once the clinic says, yes, we will move forward with this embryo donation process, then the attorneys step in and the attorneys draft which is a pretty lengthy and a pretty complex document, 25, 28, 30 pages long, negotiated between the recipient and the donor, and sometimes two donors if we're breaking the embryo down to an egg donation and a sperm donation. And we discuss all sorts of terms. Now, in egg donation, there is compensation to the donors. In embryo donation, there is not compensation to the donors. There typically is an agreement where the recipients will pay a portion of the most recent cryopreservation fee. So typically the monetary exchange between donor and recipient in an embryo donation cycle is somewhere between $500 to $1,000. So the donors have been paying storage fees to the cryopreservation facility, and they hope to recoup a small portion of those. And the recipients of these donor embryos will pay a small portion of recent cryopreservation fees. I have had clients who have called me and said, I want to donate my embryos and I want to recoup the total cost of the IVF, everything it cost me to make the embryos. So they're looking for $14,000, $17,000, $20,000 in exchange for the embryos. I won't accept those cases. I don't know many colleagues that would accept those cases. It really is, it should not be greater than 500 to really 1,000 is on the high end.
Right.
Monetary exchange between the parties.
Right.
Yeah.
Amy, it's so important that people who are thinking of this and desiring this as an option have an advocate like you who is so well versed in the process. I can't tell you that I'm all done, and so are you, creating our families, but the anxiety level, it just brings me to up here just listening, because of course, you know, I come from the emotional part of this, right? And the stamina that is necessary to go through this process, which is an amazing, brilliant possibility, but the stamina. And I think what is so important that people need to be mindful of is making sure the person that they look to for legal advice or legal guidance is someone of your caliber, because this isn't the Joe Schmo down the street who can, attorney who can just write up the agreement. And going without an agreement is something that we really need to address, because that's what, we've been seeing in the press about, embryos and embryo status and what will happen to them. So, Go ahead.
So you bring up a couple of good points there, Kristen. The first is, I'd love to be able to help everybody who wants to build their family through embryo donation, but the fact of the matter is I cannot.
Right.
You must have an attorney licensed in your state draft your agreement. Now, often in these arrangements, we've got parties in multiple states.
Right.
So in the embryo donation that I referenced, I represented the recipient mother. She was a New Yorker. The egg donor resided in Florida. The sperm donor resided in Texas. So we had choice of law. We could have drafted the agreement under New York law. We could have drafted it under Florida law. We could have drafted it under Texas law. The attorneys that I referred to for the egg provider and the sperm provider were licensed in those states. So in order for an attorney to be working on these matters, at least one of the attorneys involved has to have a connection to the state under which the agreement will be written, to the state law under which the agreement will be written. So I can't help folks who don't come to me that have some connection to, or at least the matter has some connection to New York. We have to have, in order for me to participate and provide legal counsel, the matter has to have some connection to the state of New York.
The analogy that I was making, Amy, is I tell my clients that you need to see a reproductive endocrinologist, right? Because that's who you need to be seeing.
Yeah.
So you need to be seeing a reproductive lawyer with something, with this case.
Yeah. So the attorney has to have a connection to that state.
Right.
So if somebody came to me from Illinois with embryos that were created in Colorado, I wouldn't be able to participate in that as an attorney. I would refer to either a Colorado colleague and or an Illinois colleague. However, any of your listeners, I am delighted to make those referrals. So be in touch with me. And if by virtue of my state licensure, I am not appropriate for your family building matter, I will help you find the attorneys that are. And so that's what needs, it's important for folks to understand, just because my area of expertise is assisted family building, that doesn't mean that I can provide counsel to everyone who comes to me.
Of course.
I am limited by my state licensing. Another point that you just raised is pursuing this sort of family building without an embryo donation agreement in place. And that's the 28, 30-page document I referenced before. Immediately prior to me coming up to my hotel room to speak with you this morning, I attended a meeting in a ballroom that held, and it was at max capacity, 400 to 500 physicians. It was one of the largest meetings at this conference. And the meeting was led by my law colleague, Susan Crocken. And Susan Crocken was addressing all of the legal issues that physicians need to be aware of when assisting folks in third-party family building. And the takeaway message, she left us with 6 takeaway messages. The one that's relevant here is agreements are important. Consent forms are not contracts. Consent forms are not drafted to protect the patients. Consent forms are drafted by the clinic's attorney, who was retained to advocate for their best interests. Mm-hmm. Agreements reflect the interests of the donors and the recipients. And so often clinics will counsel patients that all they need to do is sign off on a clinic consent, and the attorneys are telling patients that's not taking you far enough. There are greater layers of protection to which you can avail yourself by working with an attorney. The embryo donation agreement legal fees are nominal compared to the cost of litigating a matter where proper documentation wasn't in place. The embryo donation agreement preparation process is a fairly low stress one. it takes a relatively short amount of time. What does take a long amount of time is finding embryos and getting all of those clearances in place. Once the clinic gives us the green light, we should be about a month out from legal clearance, give or take some time. If there are 3 attorneys involved, it sometimes takes a little bit longer, but this is not a multi-month process once we are addressing the legal piece of this. And so there really is no reason for your listeners to be intimidated, either from a cost perspective, a stress perspective, or a timing perspective, from reaching out to the Council of an Assisted Family Building attorney. And I hope that that point is made quite clear. Little is lost. Yes, there are costs. It's not free. Yes, there are time commitments. It doesn't happen in a day, but they are minimal investments relative to the nightmare of finding yourself in court litigating over the status of these embryos.
Perfect. And that, I think we can end our time on and let you go right downstairs back to that conference that I wish I was with you. But thank you so much, Amy. What will end up happening is we will post this. This will be for further view on YouTube. And I also will make sure that that website, eggdonationtoday.com, is included in all promotions. So I can't wait to hear about the rest of the conference, and I'm missing you, and thank you for being there and taking the time out of the conference to speak on this important topic. So thank you, Amy.
Thanks for asking me, Kristen. Take care.
Bye-bye.